Shruti, we may go to the next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So, as the name itself suggests, third-party funding. So the concept, as is very clear from the name, is where an unconnected third party is roped in by either the claimant or the defendant of a particular suit to sort of finance the legal battle. And usually the proceeds of the arbitration or the litigation, as the case may be, they act as collateral. So, and they act as security. Um, Insofar as how TPF operates, if you all may just pay some attention to the slide on your screens. So there is a claimant at the center of this entire dispute, who is funded. The capital is contributed by a funder, where both the operating cost of the transaction as well as the cost and fees of the arbitration is funded pursuant to an agreement between the claimant and the third party funder. Once the dispute is resolved, it's either settled or there is an award in terms of money. The proceeds thereof are shared in proportion, in terms of the prior agreement between the claimant and the funder. So that's how the concept really works of third party funding. In fact, the entire third party funding has its root in in common law jurisdictions. Earlier, the view was that third-party funding is basically a glorified form of maintenance, and champerty, and therefore, they in that sense dilute the purity of justice, if we may call it, because there is a third party that has got nothing to do with a particular claim, and it still gets the right to sort of manipulate the litigation. So traditionally, maintenance and champerty were absolutely considered as sacrilegious, and in some jurisdictions, they were also considered as unlawful and illegal. In fact, till this day, Ireland considers both maintenance and champerty to be both a tort as well as a crime. Shruti, we may please move to the next slide. Thank you. This slide is basically explains, the kinds or the types of funders that we ordinarily see, prevalent in the market. The first sort of block deals with crowdfunding. If you guys are aware, there is already some hints of crowdfunding that we have sort of started to see in the Indian landscape. So in India, there is a startup by the name of Advocate. I think it's spelled as ADVOK and numeric 8. Where funding is sort of sourced from the crowd without disclosing the name of or the details of the claimants. The merits or the brief synopsis of a case is put up on the application or on their website, basis which the funds from the crowd are invited. So some sort of crowdfunding we have already started to sort of see in the Indian legal landscape. Then, of course, there are certain committed funds that are engaged with TPF funding. There are hedge funds, there are group companies, there are private equity funds, there are also family offices that engage in funding. In fact, in some jurisdictions, we have seen big law firms also engaging in third-party funding. So, in UK and US, we have seen some dominant law firms also having a separate third-party fund department within their sort of operative area. Shruti, we may move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this slide it explains the kinds of claims where funders usually invest in. So while there are and broadly they can be categorized in two different categories. The first one being a single claim where there's a dispute between two individuals and one of them actually approaches a third-party fund for funding. These are single claims. We have seen, predominantly websites like Advocate cater to in India at least. In single claims, we don't ordinarily, see big funders contribute. Because unless the dispute is really big. So what usually helps a particular funder take the decision as to whether it needs to invest in a single claim or not. I think one very important issue that they deal with or that they sort of look into is the issue of damages. So if there is likelihood to claim damages in a claim, then a fund gets interested, principally to sort of invest in that claim. Then I think the other very important aspect that a fund sort of looks into is the prospects of success. How sound is the respondent, whether he will have the resources to pay the decree, to honor the award, or whether there is any likelihood of the entire investment being categorized as a paper decree without there being any likelihood of reaping returns. The other important thing that sort of comes to our mind is whether where exactly is the seat of arbitration. I think that's also a very important part that goes into this decision-making process. And primarily the decision also rests on whether in the jurisdiction where the arbitral tribunal is seated, is third-party funding considered as lawful or not. So that's insofar as the decision-making process is concerned. Insofar as portfolio claims is concerned, in India there are two companies. The example of two companies, which is in public domain, that have actually sort of resorted to basically transfer the entire portfolio of claims with a third-party fund, either by creating a subsidiary along with that fund, or by following the SPV route. So the examples are HCC. So in HCC's case, HCC was engaged in long-drawn legal battles with a lot of government companies, predominantly with the NHAI. And when it started to have liquidity issues, at that time it transferred beneficial interest in an entire pool of its arbitrations to a fund called BlackRock. And the entire value of the beneficial interest that was transferred was about 2,000 crore rupees. And HCC agreed to transfer, the entire beneficial interest for some about 1,750 crores. So while HCC ensured that it gets liquidity in the process, the funder ensured that it looks at a direct benefit of 250 to 300 crores in case it wins the claims or the arbitrations against Government of India. The other example, that I cited was of Patel Engineering. Now, Patel Engineering also had, liquidity issues, and therefore it assigned a large part of its actionable claims, to its own subsidiary, and a fund called Eight Capital held about 51% in that subsidiary. So that's how the entire portfolio of claims was transferred by these two companies, thereby inviting third-party fund element. In the Indian landscape also, we have seen that the elements of third-party funding in the form of assignment of large portfolio of claims to interested companies. Shruti, we will move to the next slide, please. Shruti, please, thanks. Yeah, so this is how the process of third-party funding actually sort of moves. So while there is either an expression of interest by the funder, or the claimant or the respondent approaches a funder, the funder creates due diligence on the claim or the likelihood of recovery, and in doing that, it basically seeks all the evidence and the documents from the claimant. Somewhere hidden between these two activities is execution of a non-disclosure agreement. Because confidentiality, breach of privilege, etc., they are very, very important issues when it comes to third-party funding. And therefore, prior to any confidential information that is shared by the party to with the fund, it is almost about in every case that a non-disclosure agreement is executed. And once a due diligence is done and a fund is interested in funding an arbitration, a third-party fund agreement is executed, which sort of provides broadly, the terms and conditions basis which the agreement is arrived into. It also has the proportions in which the returns will be shared, between the funds, how the costs will be paid, and so on and so forth. And as the last sort of segment depicts, the agreement itself captures, the entire funding, the monitoring, and the support that the funder will provide to the entire arbitration as a whole. Shruti, we may move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide basically, provides or details out certain essential markers basis which a funder makes its decisions. So, the global investors usually, and unlike common belief, they do not control litigation strategy. They usually maintain an arm's length sort of distance, because in common law jurisdictions, even where third-party funding is very common, too much influence, is considered to be against, the permitted levels of law. And therefore, more often than not, the global investors respect that and the sanctity of, of their own boundaries created by the third-party agreement. The terms of the engagement, they of course are governed by the arrangement which has been agreed upon between the parties, which is usually the third party fund agreement. The fundamental criteria for analyzing a case is of course understanding the merits of the claims, and in doing so there is a thorough analysis by experienced people, basis which the fund actually decides whether to put its money in an arbitration or a litigation. That's what the next sort of bullet captures, which is experienced funds have experienced litigation personnel who look into the evidentiary claims, the defenses that can be raised in every type of litigation strategy in the book. They understand the financial and litigation history of the claimant. And, this is something, the next bullet is parties counsel is also screened in this process, and their standing in the legal market is analyzed to test their track record. I'm not sure how Indian lawyers are going to respond to this, and whether they would allow themselves to be screened or evaluated or assessed by a fund. Litigation budget is analyzed keeping in mind the fixed fee and the overhead cost that is usually assigned, or that is so common with a particular case. So this is how the funders usually operate. This slide captures the mechanism that the funders follow. Prior to making a decision whether to fund a particular litigation or not. So the following the next 6 slides are going to be dealt with by my colleague Shruti. Shruti, if you may please take it forward.
Thank you. So next part of the presentation is usually more legalistic than general, telling you about what TPF landscape in India is, or generally what it is about. When we talk about legal landscape, there's a lot of cloud on the fact whether it's actually legal or not. You'd be surprised. Recently, we were talking to somebody who represents the government in the state of Karnataka, and in the conversation, he actually told me that he's not sure that TPF is even legal. A, and second, if it's actually not hit by public policy of India. Argument B, and C, he thought that it was Champertis and the maintainability of the contracts will definitely hit it if not public policy argument. And to be honest, and it was quite shocking because all of these three do not apply per se to India. A, TPF is legal in India. It's not made illegal by any statute or any specific judgment so far. Second, public policy exception is also limited to it. That we see in the 1876 judgment of Ram Kumar Kundu versus Chandrakanta Mukherjee. And this is a very old judgment before independence, and in the era when common law and Indian law were supposed to go hand in hand. And the third part of champity and maintainability, which have already been covered by Rajat. All these three together form the entire cloud and the confusion that exists in the Indian system right now about legality or illegality of third-party funding and disputes as such, not only just arbitration. If you look at this first case, and I'm sure most of you have done your research, you've asked really intelligent questions, you would have read this general specific case law. This case law involved discussion on whether third-party funding is hit by the public policy. Is it Champertis or maintainable? The court said that no, it's not Champertis, it's not maintainable, it's not hit by maintainability, because both the concepts as they were in English law are not borrowed in Indian law per se. What they said would be hit in terms of a third party funding agreement is if it's extortionate, which means the amount of return that the funder is expecting is beyond something which would be conscionable or appropriate in a certain case. In that specific case, they said 40% is sort of the limit, but I think it will go on case to case basis. The second part which they said is it shouldn't be unconscionable. Unconscionable has different meanings, but let's take an example of another case that happened later in India about the Nizam of Hyderabad. He entered into there were two agreements that were entered into. One was a pure funding agreement. The other one was to exercise the funder's influence to ensure that the desirable results are obtained by the funded party. The court said that the funding agreement was absolutely correct. It was not hit by public policy exception, but what was hit was the second agreement. And the second agreement was absolutely covered by champity and maintenance, and it was against public policy of India. So what the court in the sense said that the entire arrangement needs to be looked into. You need to see if the object of the party being funded and the funder is absolutely correct and pure or not. Is it hit by public policy exceptions? Is it fomenting litigation? So the basic concern was to ensure ethics of funding are maintained and no justice has been tampered with just because a funded party can sue somebody else who does not have deeper pockets. So that's the sum and substance of how the jurisprudence has been for me. In the middle between 1908 and 2018, we say 1908 because the Civil Procedure Code Central Act was enacted in 1908. There are some specific states which talk about how third-party funding arrangements find place in our civil code. This is Order 25, Rule 1, which specifically says that a third-party financer can be called to become a party in a specific civil suit and give security for costs. Now, if you look at what security for costs are, when you sue a party in a civil contract, you say that you have a legitimate claim. And there are times when the court would ask you to submit, deposit certain amounts, and that to show that you believe in your claims, unless you would not have come to the court. And it also protects the defendant in the sense that if there are costs involved and the defendant does argue the case, puts in his money, there is a security of costs that the court will have in its power to award the defendant in case the claim of the plaintiff is not found to be meritorious. So that's one part of our civil procedure code in certain states that protects a defendant from a funded party who does not have meritorious claims. That's one part. Second part would be the recent recognition in A.K. Balaji versus Union of India by the Supreme Court of India, which said that there appears to be no bar on third-party funding in India, except it also carves out the specific exception that's provided, which is the Bar Council of India rules specifically prohibit a counsel or a lawyer from funding the party's case which he's representing. To that extent, Indian law is very clear that a funding contract can be entered into by a party. The court can make the funder party to a suit to ensure security for costs are also maintained in certain states. The counsel representing the party should not be the one funding the party. So this seems to be the current all at the end and the all of the litigation that exists in India. Recently in 2020, we also talked about how exactly contingency fee has been considered by courts. Contingency fee is an important aspect because third-party funding in other jurisdictions has also grown up and evolved, along with the restrictions on how lawyers are charging their fees and how they're being paid by the clients. That's important, and we'll go back to the original discussion, that is the first slide, which talked about how third-party funding actually enables you to fund your legal costs. Now, legal costs means costs of the lawyers. How the lawyers charge is very, very important. In other jurisdictions, there are contingency fee-based agreements which are barred in India. There are also innovative agreements such as damages-based agreements in which the parties agree to pay certain percentage of the final proceeds to the council, and that percentage is governed by the damages-based agreement. In India, none of these exist. It's contingency fee specifically barred under Bar Council of India rules. What happened in one of these cases, which is Jayaswal Ashoka Infra Private Limited versus Pansare, the Bombay High Court considered a specific agreement in which one of the parties entered into a contingency fee agreement with his own counsel, and now this counsel is not a lawyer under the Bar Council of India. He's a CA, practicing as a CA, but representing a party in an arbitration. And this also happened to be a construction arbitration. The arbitration went through and the award was granted. The award was in the favor of the party. But however, they refused to pay the counsel, which is the CA, his fee for representing them in the specific arbitration. The CA took them to the court and he defended the case. The other side said that this contract, the contingency fee contract, is hit by the public policy exception under the Contract Act. The court went into it and then they talked about two things. One, the contract is not hit by public policy exception. And the reason is not because it's just contingency fee agreement. The reason is because the person arguing and representing the party is not a counsel. Therefore, the Bar Council of India rules will not apply. And in the end, the court said that anybody who represents you, as long as the counsel representing you or your representative is not a lawyer, contingency fee is allowed. This judgment specifically is currently under appeal at the Supreme Court. Bar Council of India has been roped in as a party, and it's supposed to appear along with its affidavit, providing clarifications on whether contingency fee agreement in this specific case would be applicable or not, would be permissible or not. While we're waiting for what exactly the court says, it's most likely to come up after the COVID-19. It'll be very interesting to see and watch how the court evolves this law. Next is SR versus Northcott. This is an international arbitration where the costs for arbitration were awarded to a party which was against a party which was funded, and this uh, specific case is pending enforcement before the Bombay High Court. The Bombay High Court is supposedly said to be considering the specific question of whether third-party funding is against public policy in India or not. It remains to be seen what the court comes out with in terms of public policy exception, re-evaluating the law on championship and maintenance, what exactly third-party funded arbitrations in terms of enforcement would come to be. And this is specifically important in terms of international arbitrations because we've seen a lot of international arbitrations involving Indian parties being funded by foreign third-party funders. A case in point is also Spentex versus Quinn Emanuel. It's a very recent case in which an anti-suit injunction was sought by the party, and it was rightly denied, saying that Quinn, and one of the arguments here, not entirely the case, but the argument that Quinn Emanuel had represented the party Spentex in an investment treaty arbitration on the ground that the contingency fee charged by Quinn Emanuel was not valid under Indian law and was hit by public policy exception. The court refused to go into this question, A, because the governing contract was not under Indian law, and B, because it was not right. It was not a question that they were to answer in this specific case. But that said, it specifically gives us an idea about how Indian parties are evaluating and utilizing third-party funding, not only commercial cases, but also international investment law cases. Sorry, does anybody have a question?
Good evening, ma'am. This is Prince Story this side.
Okay.
Ma'am, I have a question concerning the case of Spentex versus Quinn Emanuel.
Okay.
Ma'am, so as you said in this case, there was the party was contending that an anti-suit injunction must be given. However, if we see the agreements talked about the arbitration between the lawyer as well as between the lawyer and the party and the client basically. So don't you think that mandatory fee arbitrations are ethically invalid? Because there is a possibility that the client is not aware of the facets of arbitration and other things amidst if we talk about arbitration.
So I think your question comes from the fact that if I've understood your question correctly, it's basically you're saying that party did not know while entering into the contract what it's entering into. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but I am also saying that don't you think that it's ethically invalid because the parties are usually not in a position to understand the nuances of arbitration and also what are the repercussions, because as we know that if a party enters into an arbitration, it is devoid of any legal discourse to the courts. So that this is my question, that don't you think it's ethically invalid?
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat the question again. I think I've understood it, but I'm not really sure. So you're saying the contract between the council and the party, or are you saying the arbitration agreement?
No, between the council and the party.
Okay, so
the mandatory fee arbitration that was there.
Right. So when we look at any agreement, it's assumed that the parties entered into the agreement with informed consent unless the party alleges that the consent it had given at the time of entering into the contract was not informed.
Okay.
So unless that's an argument,
so
that's one part to it. Second part to it is it's an assumption that when a party is entering into a commercial contract, and this fee agreement is also a commercial contract and not something different. There is fiduciary aspect to it because of the relationship. But when a commercial fiduciary relationship is in question, both the parties are understood to be and assumed to be commercially aware of the implications of entering into a contract unless otherwise is stated by the parties and proved.
Okay, all right.
In terms of ethics, I'm not sure if ethics would be a question which I think will be too relevant here. I'll also request Rajat to have his views on this question.
Yeah. So, sir, I just wanted to add this one point. So, when I was reading this case, I went on to research for the ethical considerations in mandatory fee arbitrations. So I found one paper which stated that there are basically two types of parties. One is a sophisticated party and the other one is unsophisticated party. So the ethical considerations usually revolve around the unsophisticated parties who are not usually, so basically, let's say if a party, it appoints a council. So when it appoints a council, it does not think about the fact that there can be a dispute between the council and the party itself. So that's why legal discourse can be disrupted because of mandatory fee arbitrations. This was my point.
No, see, Prince, I think what you are saying, it is very, very case specific, if I may call it like that, you know. Yes, the possibility of, an unsophisticated party not understanding the contours of the agreement or the interpretation of the agreement, that risk is always there when one talks about the existence of such agreements in India. To counter that, I think the safeguard is always present in law, where the same defense can be taken by an unsophisticated party. While you are right that such defense may not be available to a sophisticated party, an unsophisticated party, with that I mean someone who really does not know, how to understand simple English terms, even though he is coming to a court of law to litigate. If that is the position, I think the law, the courts in India, they rule both on law and equity. So yes, you may have a point, when you say that. There may be an ethical issue involved in it. But I think the courts, Prince, are well within their power to sort of to rule, in favor of such party, because as we had said, if there are certain broader elements under the Contract Act. For example, fraud vitiates everything. So if an element of fraud is sort of brought into it, then everything else gets vitiated. So I think the defense, the law sort of safeguards such parties, but in the context in which we are sort of making this presentation today, Prince, I think these issues will be more hypothetical, than real, and you may let me know if you have a different view. But and of course, anyone else in the group, if he or she feels that there is still likelihood of abuse, then But I think at least it's my view, that the law provides adequate safeguards in these cases as well.
Okay. Okay, sir.
Shruti, you want to add?
I agree with you. There's just one Delhi High Court single judge bench case, which I don't recollect the name of, but it also made a decision in the similar circumstances. The party alleged that it did not know what it's entering into. So the court said there are when a business contract or a commercial agreement is entered into between parties, it's important that we look at what is the nature of the party entering into this commercial agreement. Is it sophisticated? Is it unsophisticated? Have you entered into earlier business contracts? Because this argument or this specific defense that you're taking, I did not know. There was no consensus ad item entering into the contract. Has to be looked at carefully.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, so we have another question sent by a person from the audience. It is a hypothetical question which states that in case the parties agree for third-party funding, and then they go for enforcement of an award, which is based on such kind of agreement, and the court denies enforcement of such award, stating that third-party funding is not recognized, then what can be done in that situation?
So I think the answer is it lies with the Bombay High Court for now, because as Shruti said, this dispute is exactly what is pending before the Bombay High Court. But in a case like this, if a court were to come to a conclusion that this is opposed to public policy of the country, then the award is not enforced in India, and it becomes a paper award. So a respondent sort of stands to gain, and in times to come, unless the Bombay High Court rules in favor of the party seeking execution, I think this will be a ground which will be taken by almost every losing party. When the award is being enforced in India. Shruti, you may add if you have anything specific here.
No, I agree with you.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So moving on to our next example, which is already covered by Rajat, I'm just going to quickly sum it up. These days, the EPC industry has a lot of stressed assets, and their balance sheets are quite heavy in terms of debt. So when we look at TPF, third party funding is not just to fund disputes. We have to step back and look at companies as economic entities, which they are. Economic entities work on profit and loss and balance sheets. Now, you think of running a company in a scenario where the company has high debt and less equity, and the functioning of the company is quite difficult in the sense when it has far more negative than positive. It has less cash reserves, far more debt, and the disputes that are pending, or the disputes that are ongoing, or money that is stuck for which a dispute has to be raised, forms a part of the debt in the company. And that kind of debt is something which companies are trying to deal with. Specifically, if you look at current scenario of COVID-19, a lot of company would have a lot of pending assets that are stuck in litigation or are not being paid off. So what do companies do in that scenario? In construction and infrastructure sector, it's quite common. It's supposed to be a stressed asset sector. One of the reasons is because the disputes here are always against the government bodies, for example, NHAI, or let's say the road building authorities, or some other government PSU. So what have these companies done? Specifically, when we talk about, we've already spoken about the deals that have happened in the past with HCC and Patel Engineering. They bundled their pending claims or pending awards, which are pending enforcement, and then they took them, parked them in a specific SPV or another wholly owned subsidiary, which was either owned by an asset management company or another entity, which, in consideration of taking over all of these claims or such claims in a specific body, has given them some amount at the threshold. Now, what this amount does for them, it gives them relief on their balance sheet. The whole debt which is pending goes away to another entity. Their balance sheet becomes lighter. The negative goes to, let's say, starts moving towards positive. And they also get some money immediately to ensure that their working capital needs are met. Working capital means money available to the company for its day-to-day needs. Now, if the company has to invest in new machinery, it can do that. While it couldn't have done that earlier because it did not have the resources, what resources it had to go into fighting disputes to recover pending money. So this is a whole structure of how TPF is an asset class. It helps you unload your balance sheet. And on the other end, TPF by the funders itself gain because if you look at private equity and if you look at even the markets right now, in terms of stock markets, the returns on investment is not that high. Second, it's always dependent on the market forces. But when you look at investment through a funder into a dispute, that dispute can be audited in the beginning. Like we'd mentioned, there has to be a due diligence. It's a very merit-based decision. If a funder thinks that this dispute has merits, it will go into, let's say, giving me 80% return of what I'm putting in. It's far higher than any amount of money that any investor would put in the stock markets, because stock markets rarely do give you 80% returns. And the risk element in a stock market investment versus a disputes third-party funding arrangement would be far lesser here. So I think it's a good time to open the house for discussion. We already have a couple of questions.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi, yeah.
Yeah, we've received another question here, which basically asks that if third-party funding is present in India, how do you think it will play out as far as application of FEMA is concerned?
Go ahead, Shruti, take it.
So I think this is a good question. One, is third-party funding present in India in terms of is it is the funder India-based? And
Yes,
if the
ma'am.
funding is India-based, sorry.
Yes, ma'am. If the funder is from India, or if the arbitration is seated in India, and the arbitration is funded by a third party. Hello.
Okay, if the funder is based in India, then questions of FEMA will not arise, because FEMA usually arises when there's a foreign exchange question.
So maybe Shruti, you may answer it on the basis that the money is coming from outside India.
If we assume that in a normal structure, money is coming from outside, then definitely there's a lacuna. We don't know if the money coming in will be recognized as a capital account transaction, or what will be its status. That remains to be seen. That said, the amount of the money that is the third-party funding arrangement, so to say, in the construction industry that we talked about, the two arrangements, the money was did not really come in to directly fund the litigation. So in that sense, we don't know. There's a lack of clarity exactly it will be recognized.
Ma'am, the FEMA Act does not categorically, mention about the. It does not mention about whether how it will play out, in terms of whether it will be realized in terms of the current account or the capital account. So what will be the impact on the enforcement of the award? Will it attract public policy of India, like the claim of public policy of India under Section 34 Clause 2 in case of enforcement of award?
See, there are two parts to this question. I'm going to spread it out in that sense. One is, if your arbitration is India seated, your parties are in India, but the funder is outside and he's funding a case, then FEMA implications will arise, A. And second, in case your arbitration happens outside, but one of the Indian parties is involved and the funding is routed through India, then FEMA questions will arise. For FEMA questions to arise, I believe it's very important for the money as such to have entered India and not just the award. And that's when FEMA questions will hit the enforceability of your award. If everything has happened outside, including the third party funding and the mechanism of it, then FEMA then money directly never entered India. So I'm unable to fathom a scenario where FEMA implications will arise in that sense. And I remain to be educated in that sense, if my understanding is correct.
So sorry, go ahead. So what's your name, if I may have your name, please?
Sir, I'm Sunil Singh. I'm from third year.
Yeah, so Sunil, I think what you are asking has been answered by the Delhi High Court in Docomo as well as in Cruise City. Yeah, so if you may please go through these judgments. So you will note 2-3 things. As Shruti said, that for FEMA issues to arise, it's very important for some part of foreign exchange to enter India, and then the remittance of the foreign exchange from India to outside of India, right? So in that sense, in both those cases, in Docomo as well as in Cruise City, the court has held that just because there is one part of FEMA, that is likely, and FEMA regulation that is likely to be violated in this case, since this is an execution of a foreign award, therefore, in that sense, the FEMA issues do not get attracted. And then the court has also quoted certain treaties, etc., that India had signed, and then the court has said that it is inherent in today's commercial times and needs that awards passed by foreign seated arbitral tribunals are honored, and even if there is a lay regulation which sort of provides some sort of a hindrance to it, that cannot be said to be opposed to the public policy of the country. And in both these cases, the awards have been enforced. Yeah, so please go through these two cases, and if you have any questions, Please feel free to email, either Shruti or me. Yeah.
All right, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so
Okay, do we have any more?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Hello. Sorry.
Do we have any more questions?
Yes, sir. Actually, I had one question. Sir, I'm Divyanshi again. So I wanted to ask, like, through my limited knowledge, I've heard that third-party funders is a non-recourse loan which we get. So, sir, in that scenario, how beneficial does the third-party funder get? Like, in the sense, since if there might be some situations, they might have some litigation proceedings also going on in the arbitration. And sir, given the Indian scenario, there are so many years it takes to finally come to the judgment and everything happens. So how beneficial as a third party lender, the person who's the third party funder feels that why should they invest in India and specifically in those disputes? Like, what is the incentive they have in that scenario?
Yeah, so Divyanshi, three, four things here.
Okay.
I'll come to the changes that have been brought about by way of amendments to sort of expedite arbitrations in India. But I think what the funders and particularly big funders are looking at, are not domestic arbitrations. So they at this stage may be looking at a foreign seated arbitration involving one Indian party, where either the enforcement would lie in India or some part of it may be governed by Indian law. So I don't think they are looking to at least at this stage to invest in domestic arbitrations. That's one. Two, I think in the recent past, if we see certain amendments, say for example in the Arbitration Act, so there is no other jurisdiction, that provides that arbitrations have to be have to be expedited and that they have to be finished within a particular time frame. So I think that is a big positive. The enforcement and the execution, because I presume that you were also concerned about the time which may be sort of taken in enforcing an award. So if we look at recent judgments that the Delhi High Court has passed, Divyanshi, Delhi High Court has more often than not, refused to even issue notice in most of the challenges to an arbitral award under 34, and they are very very proactive in enforcing domestic awards also. So I think there is a great sort of push both on the side of the legislature as well as the judiciary to sort of restore the confidence of the international community in India as an arbitration hub. So while some of these fears may be well placed when one talks about say enforcement of an arbitral award in a court, say in Chhattisgarh or in Jharkhand or maybe in Hyderabad, but when it comes to commercially minded courts such as say Delhi or Bombay, and even to some extent in Calcutta, I think things are very very different. I hope I was able to answer your question, Divyanshi.
Yes, sir.
So I had two questions of my own. This is Anjali, by the way. So my question was more about the disclosure part of third-party funding. So two jurisdictions have allowed for third-party funding recently, Singapore and Hong Kong. So while CEC has given the power to the tribunal to order disclosure of third-party funding, HKIC has mandated disclosure of third-party funding altogether. So in your opinion, should should a disclosure of third-party funding be mandated in to maintain transparency in proceeding, or should it be ordered on a case-to-case basis as CI does? Also, what are the factors that the tribunals usually see to to order the parties to disclose third-party funding?
Right. So, Anjali, very important question. So I will go a step further, and both in Singapore as well as in Hong Kong, now there are these disclosures have been made statutory. You are right that SEAC it basically gives a discretion to an arbitral tribunal to seek such disclosure on a case-to-case basis. HKIAC has made it mandatory, but in litigations in both these jurisdictions, it has been made mandatory. And I think there were valid reasons also, and those I think one of the main reasons was to sort of settle the conflicts which may arise at a future point in time. So, in order to avoid any conflict of interest possibility, I think it was deemed appropriate to bring it as a matter of discretion in some cases of the arbitral tribunal, and in some other cases as a mandatory sort of a requirement. I think it is just a matter of time where other institutional bodies such as ICC, LMAA, and the like, even LCIA, they make such disclosures, at least in their rule book, possible with the discretion of the arbitral tribunal. So just to give you certain examples that may arise, for example, a funder having, say, a prior relationship with one of the arbitrators. What happens in those cases. So, in order to avoid such conflict of interest situations, what happens when an instructing counsel or when a counsel or when a law firm, has some sort of past or prior relationship with the funder. So in order to avoid these cases, I think it is made, it is thought necessary to bring about certain regulations, and it is my own view that such regulations, while they set the broader principles, they bring about a lot of efficiency and in the manner in which the disputes are run. Confidentiality issues are addressed straight away. Conflict of interest issues are addressed straight away by giving the discretion to an arbitral tribunal to seek disclosures. Does your question stand answered, Anjali?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sorry, just one more aspect here. So when one talks about domestic arbitrations, Anjali, this has not happened. So immediately prior to this presentation, Shruti and I were toying with this idea of whether we should file an application in one of our arbitrations, asking for a disclosure, from the respondent, whether there is any third-party funding element attached to it or not. So this is still untested in Indian landscape. Primarily because there are no set of regulations, if I may put it like that. So while there may be no big doubts insofar as legality of TPF is concerned in India, I think in order to make things more structured, to sort of allay doubts, on the rights of the funders to interfere, penalties, on account of duress, etc. Termination of funding agreement, confidentiality, breach of privilege, disclosures, etc. I think they will be better sort of answered in the event we have some set of regulations or guidelines governing them, Anjali.
So as we are talking about regulations, like there should be regulations. Another thing that I find to be a gray area is the fact that there is no set amount as such, up to which a third party can fund a particular party in arbitration. different institutions might have different set of rules as to what, like under what circumstances can a third party fund such arbitration. So do you think setting a particular, let's say, amount or particular situation is necessary to ensure that this provision of third party funding is not misused, or is it not necessary and it should be again seen case to case basis?
My view is that there should be some sort of flexibility in the joints which should be given to the parties. So while there should be no hard and fast straight jacket sort of approach which should be regulated, I personally feel that it should be left open to the parties, because third party funding decisions are usually either taken because of lack of funds, so anyone can have lack of funds irrespective of the quantum of the claim involved. And in other cases they are usually taken because a party wants to sort of manage its risks in a better way. I think in both these cases the option should lie with the party that is opting for third party funding. I mean, that's my view. Shruti, you may add your views.
I completely agree with you. One reason that we may not add, actually two parts to it. One, when we look at the proportion by which funders think about it, if they're investing 1 rupee into you, they will expect 10 times the return. That's their understanding, 1:10.
Yes, ma'am.
In terms of ratio. But that said, that's not always the case with all funders. Under Indian law, it's if you go back to Ram Kumar Kundu, it says 40% is something which would be okay, non-extortionate. So we already have this kind of an indicator, and the basic law or the basic objection which it's hit the third party funding agreements is it being against public policy on grounds of being extortionate. And when we look at the term extortionate and public policy together, public policy evolves. What may be extortionate, let's say, in 2000 may not be extortionate today. So that's it. Rajat's point on keeping it generally open to changes is the most important.
Right. Ma'am, my next question is related to investment arbitration and third-party funding in the same. So we know that investment arbitration is very much different from commercial arbitration. There are certain investment treaties such as CETA and ICSID who have allowed for third-party funding in their treaty itself. However, despite that, we haven't seen much scope of third-party funding, or third-party funding in general in investment arbitration has been rather scarce. So what are the reasons why third-party funding is not very popular in investment arbitration in general? Or like if we do have any challenges that kind of discourages third-party funders to fund an investment arbitration altogether?
Rajat, do you want to take this?
No, go ahead, Shruti, take it. Go ahead.
So I think you're very right about investment treaty arbitration, but I think there are two parts to it. One, because investment treaty arbitrations are usually governed, are usually done confidentially. So we don't really get to know about third-party funding being available. For example, in the case that was before the Delhi High Court, we don't know if there was third-party funding involved at all. In fact, we didn't even know such claim exists. So that's one part of it, the confidentiality and non-disclosure of these these arbitrations per se, even though the sovereign governments are involved. And that's one of the criticisms of investment treaty arbitrations, that even if the government is involved, their own citizens are not aware of what exactly is the situation of their funds. That's one part. Second, you're correct in saying that certain treaties do recognize third-party funding arrangements, but that's only to ensure that an investment treaty is not hit by it. There are several other reasons, definitely. But when we talk about sorry?
Yeah, sorry, ma'am. Continue.
Okay. So there are several instances in which a class of individuals, in the sense shareholders, they were funded by a third party to pursue a claim.
Hello?
A corporation. Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, Shruti, sorry, now you're audible. You were breaking a bit. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
Sorry, till when did you lose me?
Ma'am, I think towards the last sentence, like last part of your sentence, it wasn't audible.
Okay, so there are cases in investment treaty arbitrations where a class of shareholders of a company have been able to implicate themselves in an international investment arbitration with the help of a public amicus curiae in that sense. So third-party funding itself is not prohibited. What is prohibited it being used to foment litigation. A second, also the considerations that whether this is justified or not, because investment treaty arbitrations are usually governed by specific BITs and the agreement specifically entered into between the parties. What if the BIT does not cover this kind of scenario? What if it's the third-party funding itself is barred?
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, in the questions that we had sent you earlier, there was this one question about the due diligence that is involved while you get third-party funding. So it would be great if you and Rajat sir could expand over it and let us tell us how, in what way can a person, a funded party, go through due diligence to ensure that there is no situation later on which might nullify the third-party funding altogether.
I think just two things from me here, and I'm sure Shruti will add. I think the best way is to while conducting due diligence is to seek information from the funder, directly. That's how things are done if it's a new fund. One needs to find out if how good the capital sort of backup is there with the funder. What is the source of the capital with the funder? In some cases, even the reliability of that source. Is there a sunset clause, if I may put it like that, and so on and so forth. According to me, it's very important when you are selecting a fund that you check the capital with the fund, number one, and the source and reliability of that capital. Shruti?
Uh, I agree with all of these points. Just one point to talk about in terms of, I think there were questions also that said that how do we approach a funder and how do we know if we need funding? In that sense, we need to take a step back and also realize that funding is not need based. Funding in the funder's eye is only merit based. So when you do your due diligence, you also have to do a due diligence. You also have to understand that it works both ways. You will do a due diligence on the funder to ensure that he's got money to see you through the commitment he's making. A and B, the funder will look at your case and do the due diligence on you as a party, on the case as such. And Rajat has covered it in the beginning itself, and the defendant itself. What if at the end the funder realizes that he's funded your case, you've got an award in your favor, but the party you are going against itself is insolvent, so all the money that he's invested is lost? And that due diligence point is very clear in the beginning itself. How am I going to recover my money when I get an award?
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Does this answer your question?
Yes, ma'am, it does.
So do we have more questions?
If anyone else has a question, please unmute yourself and you can ask Rajat and Shruti right now.
Otherwise, you can just email your questions to us. We'll be more than happy to respond.
Sure, sir. So I don't think we have any other questions now.
All right. Thank you so much, for having us. We hope we were able to sort of, I'm so sorry. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
I I hope we were able to answer all your questions. And if you have, any more questions, please feel free to get in touch with any one of us. Yeah. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us for today's session. It was great having you. We have recorded this session and we'll be sending it across on LinkedIn and YouTube. So it would be available to larger reach altogether. Thank you so much for your time. It was really great interacting with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.